When the Academy Awards roll around each year, the same old discourse takes place about whether or not the Oscars matter. Are they a good way to find the best films released in any given year, or an accurate way to gauge the quality of any given film? Well, not really. Sometimes they get things right.
The winner is William Peter Blatty for The Exorcist.
Often they get things wrong.
And the Oscar goes to Crash.
And without fail, many great films go completely unrecognized, especially foreign language films. However, there's no room for debate over whether or not the Oscars matter when it comes to the careers of the winners. For a film industry professional, winning an Oscar is, no surprise, a huge deal for their career. Even being nominated without winning is a huge deal. Oscar winner or Oscar nominee will permanently precede their name on movie posters and in trailers for the rest of their cinematic output. Projects can be funded entirely off the back of the involvement of an Oscar-winning star, and for a director, winning an Oscar can sometimes tear down budgetary barriers and shut up skeptical industry gatekeepers. Winning Best Picture gets a filmmaker the metaphorical keys to the kingdom to make whatever passion project they wish. Or at least, that's how it used to be. That could still be the case sometimes in certain ways, but the downfall of director Michael Cimino might well have put a damper on that for all future filmmakers. For Michael Cimino, winning multiple Oscars directly led to the end of his career.
I love you madly. Thank you.
Michael Cimino made his feature film directorial debut in 1974 with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, starring the buddy pairing of Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges. For his role, Bridges was nominated for the Best Supporting Actor Academy Award, but Cimino's real Oscars attention arrived with his second film, 1978's The Deer Hunter. This chunky drama with a runtime of over 3 hours brought together an all-timer cast to probe the psychological devastation of a group of friends caused by the Vietnam War. It wasn't the first film made about the Vietnam War, but it was the first major release from the new Hollywood movement to take a critical look at it. It beat Apocalypse Now to the theaters by a year, and it entered pre-production in 1976, according to the American Film Institute, just 1 year after the Vietnam War officially ended, and 3 years after the U.S. withdrew from the country. And beyond all of that important historical context, it's also simply an incredible film. It's fair to say that you feel the length, and some viewers might consider it slow these days, especially in the first half with how much time is spent before they go off to the war. But that early character building is key to making you really feel the bond between these characters before they're torn apart and left irrevocably changed. And the abrupt jump from these friends spending their last hunting trip together to them in the thick of it in the war is one of the best harsh cuts in the history of cinema. We don't see any of the patriotic heroics that Americans are usually spoon-fed in war movies. We don't even see them entering the jungle. The very first time we see any of our lead characters in this situation is De Niro, already a bloody mess, lying on top of a corpse and looking like he might be dead himself. Seriously, this editing choice is so good and so striking that it should be taught in film schools with the same reverence as the match from Lawrence of Arabia. The Deer Hunter was nominated for 9 Oscars and ended up winning 5 of them. Best Sound, Best Editing, Best Supporting Actor for Christopher Walken, Best Director for Michael Cimino, and the Big Dog Best Picture Oscar, which Cimino shared with the film's other producers. A lot of great films came out in 1978, but I agree with all of these wins, and even think you could throw a couple of extra Oscars the film's way too. With a box office hit as his directorial debut and a Best Picture winner as his sophomore effort, Cimino was one of the hottest names in Hollywood. The world was his oyster for his third film, but that film would end up destroying his career just as soon as he had rocketed into the Hollywood stratosphere. No filmmaker has gone from winning Best Picture to total career self-destruction so quickly before or since. It's quite a speed run, and I imagine his record will go forever unbroken. The massive success of The Deer Hunter landed Cimino a 2-picture deal with United Artists. But what followed was such a disaster that the second of those two pictures never came to fruition. Cimino entered production on his third film just 1 week after taking home his Oscars. The film was Heaven's Gate, which, just in case you aren't familiar, is completely unrelated to the Heaven's Gate cult. If you've ever heard of 1980s Heaven's Gate, it was likely in a derisive context as a notorious disaster. The film does have some major issues, but I would say it's ultimately still really good and even dips into outright greatness here and there, though it doesn't quite stick the landing for me. And on paper, it sounds like it should have been another surefire hit. It's actually pretty similar to The Deer Hunter in a lot of ways. It's another film with a gargantuan runtime, even longer this time at nearly 4 hours long. It brings together another great cast, and it employs a similar structure that develops characters in one context to juxtapose them against themselves after being deeply changed by a tumultuous period of American history. Sure, it's nowhere near as good as The Deer Hunter, but few films are. I did name The Deer Hunter the 52nd best film ever made on my top 250 ranking after all. From the outset, everyone who signed on for Heaven's Gate must have expected another big hit, and the film's massive critical and financial failure must have blindsided them. If you are familiar with how chaotic, disastrous, and expensive the production of Apocalypse Now was, imagine that, but if it never ended up finding the critical and commercial success that buoyed it back up and made it work out in the end, and you'd have a pretty good idea of what happened with Heaven's Gate. The film did still earn some awards attention in the end, including a Best Art Direction nomination at the Academy Awards, and more notably a Palme d'Or nomination at the Cannes Film Festival, an honor that many film lovers, including myself, place a greater importance on than the Oscars. But despite some people being able to see the film's merits early on, it wasn't until much, much later that the film underwent some proper reevaluation and had its quality reputation somewhat remedied, though there's no hindsight on the financial disaster component.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Film Club. Tonight we're going to have the temerity to show you, in its rarely seen complete form, one of the most expensive failures in the history of post-war Hollywood. But wait, don't turn your set off, because Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate is eminently worth seeing. A flawed masterpiece which may have sunk a studio and been generally reviled, especially by those who've not seen it complete, but which shows Cimino to be a quite exceptional director. Many of us in Britain find the major set pieces, like the opening Harvard University graduation scene, have the choreographic brilliance and carefully orchestrated panache that not only make for visual splendor, but also give meaning to the story. Like Cimino's earlier and very successful film, The Deer Hunter, it's both a paean to patriotism and a strong criticism. And the interrelation of these two viewpoints is what makes the film so fascinating.
It wasn't just that the film flopped horribly at the box office, it was also extremely over budget long before production had finished. According to the American Film Institute, the initial budget for the film was $7.8 million, which is equivalent to around $35 million in today's money. But the film would end up costing much, much, much more than that by the time shooting wrapped. But Cimino was already no stranger to going over budget. He had just done it on The Deer Hunter, where his initial budget of $8.5 million ended up nearly doubling to around $15 million. The difference is, it worked out that time, and it probably gave him some false confidence, if not outright arrogance, that he could go way over budget again and things would still work out in the end. And if nearly doubling the budget on The Deer Hunter wasn't bad enough, the final Heaven's Gate cost surpassed double the initial budget, passed triple the initial budget, passed quadruple the initial budget, and I kid you not, even surpassed quintuple the initial budget. When all was said and done, Heaven's Gate cost an estimated $44 million, according to the New York Times. And that's not even counting the extra approximately $6.5 million spent on marketing and re-editing the film. At the time, Heaven's Gate was the most expensive Hollywood film ever made, despite only being greenlit with what was considered a pretty standard budget for the time at $7.8 million. The same year that The Empire Strikes Back earned $209 million, Airplane earned $83 million, and Cheech and Chong's next movie earned $41 million at the box office, Heaven's Gate earned just under $3.5 million at the box office. And that's worldwide. The domestic box office was even lower at around just $1.5 million, according to the Final Cut documentary. To put this in current terms, adjusted for inflation, we're talking about a film costing the equivalent of over $227 million, bringing in just $15.5 million worldwide. A fat loss of about $212 million, making it the biggest box office flop ever at the time, a loss that has only been surpassed a couple of times in all of the years since. I mentioned earlier that the second film in Cimino's two-picture deal with United Artists never came to fruition, but the reality was actually a little bit worse than that. Not only did United Artists not produce Cimino's next film, the company never made another film, at least not in its original form. United Artists was started way back in the 1910s by Charlie Chaplin, amongst other people, and the financial disaster of Heaven's Gate almost single-handedly killed the company. The studio had a couple of other duds around the same time, but they also had plenty of huge hits, and it was the money pit of Heaven's Gate continuing to get more and more expensive that ultimately did them in. The president of the company resigned over the debacle, other people were fired, and the remains of the financially destroyed company were sold off to MGM soon afterward. And this meant that other films that had been greenlit ended up getting canned.
The company had been put through turmoil. Other projects had gotten canceled or never made.
We don't know what those films were or how many there would have been, but it does mean that along with torpedoing Cimino's own career, Heaven's Gate also killed other productions and prevented other directors from getting their films made. This was a very direct negative ripple effect on other filmmakers, but there were plenty of other less direct ripple effects that hurt filmmakers as well.
Now we come to one of the biggest movie stories of the year, Heaven's Gate, the $36 million Western with a message that was first released last November in New York City, where it was thoroughly roasted by critics there and then pulled from release after only 1 week's run, pulled to be re-edited from its running time of more than 3.5 hours. I saw the long version of the film in New York back in November, and it was pretty much of a mess. Bad sound, confusing characters and locations. Now, however, the film's been cut by 40%. It runs 2 hours and 18 minutes, and it's still a turkey.
Along with the terrible box office results, and certainly not helping the film's financial performance, were the scathing reviews that the film received.
It's mostly because of the illogical character relationships, though, that Heaven's Gate, in its long form and its short form, fails completely.
Okay, now I agree with everything you've said so far. I want to go on and add some more categories. First of all, this is the most unpleasant movie to look at that I can remember. Not only do you get all the dust that we saw in that scene,
Yes.
but in other scenes you have smoke, you have fog, you cannot see the people, you can't see what they're doing. Then every scene is shot in soft focus, and it's all toned down into sepia tones of kind of a dirty, muddy yellow, so that there's nothing pleasant to look at. It's almost as if they set out to spend $36 million and put almost nothing on the screen.
Well,
I was really shocked. I went to see it, I thought, gee, it can't be as bad as everybody said it was as bad as everybody said.
The first big review trashing the film, according to the Final Cut documentary, was written by Vincent Canby and appeared in the New York Times. Canby said that the film, quote, fails so completely that you might suspect Mr. Cimino sold his soul to the devil to obtain the success of The Deer Hunter, and the devil has just come around to collect. Which is just absolutely brutal. And he ended his review by writing, quote, Heaven's Gate is something quite rare in movies these days, an unqualified disaster, end quote. When Roger Ebert reviewed the film later on in 1981, he gave it 1.5 stars out of 4 and said, quote, this is one of the ugliest films I've ever seen, end quote. And he called it both a study in wretched excess and the most scandalous cinematic waste I have ever seen. Ebert was far from alone in these sentiments. And if you're wondering why he waited a year to review it, that's because after the film was initially released in 1980 and had its first wave of critical backlash, it was quickly pulled from theaters at none other than Michael Cimino's request to be re-edited and put back out later on at a reduced length. But instead of turning the review sentiment around, it only resulted in the film being critically panned twice. The original cut was over 4 hours long, the cut that Ebert reviewed was 2 hours and 20 minutes, and another critic, Jerry Roberts, watched both a 3 hour and 43-minute cut and a 2 hour and 18-minute cut, and wrote in 1981, nothing that I've seen so far tells me that there is a better film waiting to be discovered. At either length, this is the most ungainly, untidy, unfocused mess that I've ever had the displeasure to witness. There have been a number of other alternative cuts put out over the years, including one made by Steven Soderbergh in 2006. who has done this for a few movies that he finds interesting over the years. Soderbergh put his edit online on his website, acknowledging the huge breach of copyright that it was, and that page is actually still up and viewable today. There's a link to it in the description if you're curious. Just know that Marianne Bernard, the supposed editor who did this cut, is a pseudonym used by Soderbergh. His version is by far the shortest at around an hour and 40 minutes sans credits, and Soderbergh called it the Butcher's Cut and wrote, "As a dedicated cinema fan, I was obsessed with Heaven's Gate from the moment it was announced in early 1979, and unfortunately, history has shown that on occasion a fan can become so obsessed they turn violent toward the object of their obsession, which is what happened to me during the holiday break of 2006. This is the result," end quote. He also included a text slide at the beginning of the film that reads, quote, "I acknowledge that what I have done with this film is both immoral and illegal," end quote. I gave Soderbergh's version a watch to see how it compares, and I think it's quite interesting. It holds together as a film relatively well, even with all of that streamlining. But a lot is definitely lost to achieve that brevity. And honestly, it still feels like a pretty long film, even when it's chopped down to under 2 hours. There are many really interesting editing choices made throughout within scenes and interesting decisions made regarding how to reorder and rearrange things, but you really lose a lot of crucial character development especially. My partner Gray watched the Soderbergh cut with me without having seen any other version of the film, and found the cinematography and production design to be incredible, but wasn't pulled in by any of the characters outside of Isabelle Huppert, and didn't get that much out of the overall story in this truncated form. Ultimately, I think Soderbergh's cut is an interesting curiosity that's likely better off watched after seeing a longer cut for the sake of comparison more than it is a replacement or a cure for that excess of footage. The first version of Heaven's Gate that I watched, and which I do recommend, is the cut that the Criterion Collection put out, which clocks in at 3 hours and 36 minutes, so in between the extremes, but closer to the longer end of the spectrum. It still has some issues, and there are definitely certain scenes that feel like they go on for way too long and could feasibly be cut entirely, but I think enough meddling has already been done with the edit, and we should just leave Heaven's Gate alone at this point and judge it as it is, not as what it could be reshaped into. Part of the reason why the edit is such a messy affair is because the film was initially rushed out the door before it was ready. The shoot ran extremely long after falling behind schedule almost immediately, and Cimino and his editors weren't done putting the film together by the time they were contractually obligated to put it out. The re-editing that followed wasn't so much a finishing of the editing that had been interrupted, as it was a mad scramble to salvage a project that was already deemed a disaster. And to be fair to Cimino, it was already being deemed a disaster in the press before anybody had even seen the film. The stories and controversies on set became mad tabloid fodder and worked towards sealing the film's fate as a chaotic mess long before shooting had wrapped. And as mentioned earlier, it wasn't just Cimino's own career that was damaged by the failure of Heaven's Gate. It caused negative fallout on the entire film industry and the New Hollywood movement as a whole. Some people go so far as to blame Heaven's Gate for single-handedly ending the New Hollywood movement altogether, but I think this is going a little bit too far. New Hollywood was already sort of coming to a close on its own, and in fact, I suspect that if Heaven's Gate had been made and released in the mid-70s instead of 1980, while that cinematic movement was at full strength, it would have fared considerably better both critically and commercially. But the times were already changing by the time it saw the light of day. But I do think it's fair to say that it might have hastened along New Hollywood's demise. But even if it can't really be blamed for ending New Hollywood altogether, it did definitely have a knock-on effect for the other New Hollywood auteurs, with Cimino positioned as a figurehead for what their freewheeling lack of studio oversight could lead to.
The 70s studio system changed a great deal, and the week that film was released was the same week from the same studio that Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate opened. That, A Raging Bull, Apocalypse Now, all from the same studio, United Artists. That ended what the 70s, they call this, golden age, etc. But really, it ended the power of the director, in a way, in American filmmaking. And that had to come back through independent cinema, another way, through the 80s. The 70s was very much that way because things were wide open. And we went in and we took it, like the barbarians at the gate. And we transformed whatever we could, but they caught us.
There's so many things come to my mind with Heaven's Gate. Iraq even comes to mind. It's, I think Heaven's Gate was used by powers that be to stop a way of filmmaking where the author was the director and was in control of the money.
Do you describe that diversity in your own careers as reflecting the changes in the industry, or is it something that you yourself pursued? Marty?
I think it came out of the change in the industry in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And I know Francis started earlier, even the 60s. And somehow in the 70s, that decade, we were able to make pictures. People weren't talking about how much a picture was making. I mean, at a certain point, yes, how much money it would make or how much they would be able to risk. But primarily, they were talking about the new Terry Malick picture, or the new Paul Schrader picture, or that sort of new Francis Coppola film. These were films that were like, they were proud to make, in a way. They were proud to underwrite, I think, filmmakers with, and I don't want to use it because it could become a dirty word, but vision. A vision, meaning that they have a way of telling a story, give them as much control. And that built up to, of course, United Artists, which was an extraordinary place, making Heaven's Gate. Now, I made a picture there, Raging Bull, at the same time. In fact, Raging Bull opened 10 days before Heaven's Gate. And when that folded, we folded too with it. The picture was hardly re-released. The establishment of the UA executives left. It was a complete mess, and everything was really over at that point.
From my experience, I saw at the end of the 60s, I mean, I actually worked for Jack Warner, and I actually knew Sam Goldwyn, and I think the climate at the end of that traditional studio period was coming to an end, and it was a little bit of a no man's land, Wild West. And
yes.
The movies that I got to make in the 70s, and I'm pretty much known for 5 years where I made The Godfather and Conversation and Godfather 2 and Apocalypse, and that was purely that we were just running too fast for anyone to stop us.
Yeah.
We never got permission to start on those movies. We just sort of started, and by the time they realized what we were doing, we already had those films in production, and in the case of Apocalypse, we really had to almost finance it. So it wasn't so much that it was a great time, but it was they hadn't yet gotten their middle management in place. They control movie making. It's very hard to run away from them now because they have such a big army of people watching you. It's been now 15 years or so since Heaven's Gate, which is the film that I date, that basically they weren't going to put up with these directors.
They weren't going to put up with us anymore.
Yeah, it was a coup d'etat.
Complete coup d'etat. The 70s, the decade of director, or sort of director as author, quote unquote. What's the word? Acknowledged author, in a way.
And also they considered a kind of runaway that now the corporations were seeing, the entertainment business is a big, big worldwide business, and we can't tolerate a director or that type of mentality running away. Budgets are wildly out of control. These guys are making too much money, and they really clamped on their big. They built up their middle managements, and they got a kind of culture police to be sure that no one could run away and start a production without, quote, a green light, which was not a phrase I had ever heard before.
No. I'm still waiting for mine this year.
Well, that's the trouble.
The reasons for the shoot being so delayed and so over budget are numerous. Some of the issues were out of anyone's hands, like an unexpected snowstorm getting in the way. But many other issues were, in fact, completely avoidable and often Michael Cimino's fault directly. Like insisting on building an entire city block to shoot on, which took months of work and tons of money, only for Cimino to not end up shooting anything there and instead having it torn down because it apparently wasn't quite as wide as he wanted it to be, and then having it rebuilt later on, which is a very silly reason to waste so much time, effort, and money. There were many, many more instances of similar wastes of time and money in service of very little or nothing at all at the end of the day. Many crew members would describe Cimino as a perfectionist and uncompromising to an extreme and needless degree, and there were a lot of reports of his ego ballooning pretty far out of control, no doubt fueled directly by the success of The Deer Hunter.
Heaven's Gate, I'm a glorified extra. Michael Cimino has just won the Oscar. It's supposed to be shot in 8 weeks and cost like $8 million or something. It blows up to 8 months and $40 million. Well, after 3 months, I was in the first 3 months, and one day we're sitting in a lighting setup, and someone told me 8 hours sitting in a lighting setup, full makeup, full costume. We're not even going to shoot. We're just seeing how the light is for shooting the next day. It's a little tedious, but I'm a patient man. I'm sitting there. Someone told me a joke, and I laughed audibly. Michael Cimino, the director, had his back to this group. He heard the laugh, and he just turned around and said, "Willem, step out."
Ah.
And I imagine that he probably regretted doing it, but he was under a lot of pressure.
Wow.
And he basically, I
Couldn't
walked
go
out
back
and
after
everybody
that.
was like, "Ugh." And then I went back to the hotel room, and then like fourth AD came and gave me a plane ticket. I said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing, nothing." I said, "What happened? Tell me, what's the problem?" And he said, "Nothing. Your character's done. It's great. You did great. You go home." I'm like, okay. And of course, I felt humiliated, and I went back to the theater happily and said, "I guess this is not for me." So
There were also a lot of rumors that some of his mania was fueled by rampant cocaine usage during production, but Cimino has denied this even many years later when speaking to Vanity Fair in 2010, which was a rarity as he largely avoided interviews and press of any kind, and hadn't even been photographed himself for 20 years prior to that write-up. As a quick aside, all of my sources are linked in the description, but if you decide to read the Vanity Fair article, I want to warn you that the author of that article, for some reason, decided to spend a big chunk of the word count there transvestigating Cimino, because there were rumors of gender reassignment surgery being something that Cimino was pursuing, which Cimino has always said was just one of the numerous rumors made up about him and is completely untrue. Nevertheless, that Vanity Fair author dedicated several paragraphs to this thread with lots of regressive language and extremely prejudiced thinking. As described by Vanity Fair, Cimino went into seclusion after Heaven's Gate. He made a few more movies over the years: Year of the Dragon in 1985, The Sicilian in 1987, based on a book from Godfather writer Mario Puzo, Desperate Hours in 1990, and lastly The Sun Chaser in 1996, the latter of which was released straight to video after poor festival reception, and none of which made anywhere near the kind of impact of his earlier work. And that relatively small body of work across all those years was certainly not for lack of trying. Cimino claimed to have written around 50 feature films that he was unable to get funded, undoubtedly because of the stain that Heaven's Gate left on his career. He began writing novels as well, with one called Big Jane, supposedly finding initial success overseas, but it doesn't seem to have ever found a US publisher, nor did his other books. Cimino's self-isolation and eccentricities drew comparisons to Howard Hughes, and those do feel apt in a sense. Part of the gargantuan failure of Heaven's Gate was unfair. Part of it was out of his control, but a big part of it really was his fault. Even after the budget had ballooned way out of control, Cimino refused to compromise on anything and kept putting the production further and further in the hole, wasting money on things like putting thousands of extras through extensive training on all kinds of specialized skills that they in no way needed to know how to perform. He also put people through grueling conditions with frequent 18-hour shooting days and created an extremely unsafe work environment, going as far as to force extras to carry out feats that really should have been performed by professional stunt people, and according to Rolling Stone, intentionally running some of them over with period vehicles for the sake of realism. Now, to be totally fair to Cimino, there was a lot said about him that was motivated by extrinsic factors and may have been exaggerated or entirely made up for the sake of scandalous headlines, but I've tried to stick to what has been corroborated by multiple sources and can most likely be asserted as true, and there's plenty of poor behavior to pull from there. Pursuing perfectionism and refusing to compromise on his vision, that's one thing, but as soon as he began exploiting the people working for him, his conduct crossed into another realm entirely. Those aspects of this whole debacle are inexcusable. With the way Cimino behaved on set, he had really already torpedoed his reputation in Hollywood even before the film came out. Heaven's Gate was a production disaster for a multitude of reasons, but at the end of the day, it's the result of a hotshot filmmaker thinking he was too big to fail when that simply wasn't true. But despite all that, there is a lot to appreciate about the resulting film, and its legacy was tarnished far more than it should have been. Luckily, the strengths of the film shone through to some people from the get-go, and it has been more and more favorably reevaluated over time.
Heaven's Gate was undoubtedly a hideously undisciplined luxury in its making, which was the fault as much of United Artists as of Michael Cimino. But now the dust has settled, it's possible to see it in a different light, as a vast, uneven, but really rather glorious epic, which told Americans what a lot of them didn't want to know about their own history.
In Curtis Sui's tribute to Michael Cimino for the Criterion Current, written shortly after Cimino's death, Sui reflected on Cimino's involvement in the Criterion Collection's restoration of Heaven's Gate, which was put out in 2012, just a couple of years before Cimino's passing. He wrote, quote, Some months after our release of Heaven's Gate, I received a phone call from Michael. He told me how gratifying the entire experience of remastering the film had been, how invigorating it was to work with everyone here, and how the collaboration had, in many ways, represented an ideal production process for him. I couldn't have been more thrilled to hear his words, not only because we'd been able to match his standards, but also because he was finally, rightfully, able to find joy in his film once more. End quote. I'm glad this restoration was able to happen within Cimino's lifetime. It might have taken more than 3 decades to get to that point, but I think, despite all the self-sabotage, it is ultimately beautiful that Cimino was eventually able to see his film presented in the light that it deserved and begin receiving the reevaluation that it needed. Let's keep that going.